Chair Bridgeman, you're live on YouTube.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our Special Planning Committee and Official Plan Review Working Group meeting this morning. It is a continuation from our prior meetings. I welcome everybody here today, and without further ado, we'll get going. I'm calling this to order at 9:03 this morning. This is being held in accordance with Section 238 of the Municipal Act 2001 due to COVID-19. I am verbally confirming that we have a quorum. We have all councillors here with the exception of Councillor Nishikawa, who I'm guessing will come in. We haven't received regrets from her. And we have all members of the steering committee with us. And I also see we have our senior staff with us. So I think we're ready to go on that. Planning at muskokalakes.ca was the email that anybody could send comments into. I don't believe we received any for this particular meeting. And just a reminder that today's meeting is live streamed and recorded on the Township of Muskoka Lakes website and YouTube channel. By participating in this open public meeting today, you are consenting to your image, voice, and comments being recorded and posted online. And as is normal now, all motions are pre-populated just to expedite the process, and voting is by our hands. And if that's an issue, we'll call for a vote, but it will not be a recorded vote. There is no supplementary agenda today. Any disclosure of pecuniary interest? Okay, all right. So I will read the motion which relaxes our rules for the meeting today. Moved by Councillor Hayes, seconded by Councillor Kelly. Be it resolved that pursuant to Section 2.3.2 of the Township's Procedural Bylaw 2019-079, the rules of procedure are hereby suspended for the duration of the official plan review of the first draft, and that they be reinstated at the conclusion of the review. Any comments? All in favor? Carried, Madam Clerk. Okay, great. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Mr. McDonald. I think without further ado, the steering committee did meet on Monday. I believe we're going to get a report from the chair, Councillor Roberts, under new items at the end, so we can continue with our process for today. And a break at 10:30 would be perfect. So if you'd like to take it over, away you go.
Great. Thank you very much, Chair Bridgeman, and good morning, members of the Planning Committee and the working group. Looking forward to another fruitful discussion today. I see 3 items on the agenda. If we can get through all 3, that would be fantastic. The first item I think we should jump right into is the resort policy framework. We did discuss there being a need to look at that separately. And I think the best thing to do is to start off with that. So what I plan to do is provide you with a brief overview of the policy framework that has been developed for discussion purposes, and then open it up for discussion. Second item on the agenda would be to finish off the remaining policy directions. There aren't that many. 6 of the 8 or so are quite minor, and I'm thinking won't require much discussion, but there are a couple there that I anticipate there will be some input and feedback provided, so we'll do that. And then the third item will be to review the chart that I prepared in advance of today's meeting, which looked at the cumulative impacts of the many changes we are making to policy as a result of the policy directions that were endorsed and which were relied upon by the consulting team to prepare policy. I'm thinking we might not get to that today, but if there is that chance to do that, that would be great. And essentially, as promised before, I guess at the last meeting, there was, I guess, not a concern, but more a curiosity about all of the effects of the policy directions, particularly as it relates to waterfront development. So we did spend some time as a team looking at each of those policies and identifying what they say now as proposed, what they say today, and where the direction came from to make the changes. So that has been sent around, I know, to all of you, and I look forward to discussing that. then, of course, after that would be the new matters or other business, which is quite frankly undefined and could take some time because I'm not sure what all of those other matters will be. But I'm already thinking that there probably will be need for another meeting because I just don't see how we're going to get through all of that today. And again, I would suggest a hard stop at 12 o'clock. I think that's about as much as everyone can do on this kind of stuff on a Friday morning. So 12 o'clock will be the hard stop. If that's okay with you, Chair Bridgeman, I'd like to launch into it unless there are any questions or suggestions on what I just said.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McDonald. Anybody have any questions, thoughts? Just a quick thank you too, because the chart that you sent out was really, really helpful. So thank you for that. And I think we're good.
Great. Excellent. So I'm going to launch right into the resort policy framework. And there are 3 sections of the official plan in draft that kind of work together that get us there. And so I'm going to look at section B6 first. Those are a series of tourism development policy objectives that have been developed. And I'll just give everyone a few seconds to get there on their screens or with the paper they have in front of them. So I'm just going to launch into it. So as I mentioned in the first meeting, we established a number of policy objectives at the beginning of the official plan to provide overall direction on how the policies are to be, I guess, to provide the basis for the policies that come afterwards. And they really are intended to set the tone for what the policies are intended to do. So in this particular section, there are a series of policy objectives that deal specifically with tourism development. Now, I realize tourism development goes beyond resorts, but there are a number of objectives in this section which deal specifically with resorts. And I'm just going to go through a few of them just so that everyone is aware of how we've I guess, put the plan together to deal with this particular issue. So these objectives, I guess, I'll go through a few of them. So item A, for example, is a very important one. It's a key objective within the district's plan as well, and that is to continue to recognize the link between the natural environment and the tourism economy, emphasizing the need to protect natural areas, features, and functions as a means to ensure that the tourism sector remains viable. Secondly, promoting the maintenance, expansion, and upgrading of existing tourist destination uses, and encouraging the establishment of additional high quality attractions, facilities, accommodation services, and so on. C talks about strengthening the tourism sector. D, facilitating the establishment of a competitive tourist business environment. E, to encourage tourism-related development and redevelopment that demonstrate sustainable economic, social, and environmental practices. To protect environmentally sensitive areas. And item F, G, ensure the protection of the character of waterfront areas. H, which is important obviously for resorts, ensure that existing and new resorts are commercial in nature so that travelers and vacationers continue to visit the township and contribute to the local economy. Recognizing, of course, the cottaging and short-term rentals have an impact on the tourism economy as well. Encourage year-round tourism opportunities, and lastly, ensure that staff housing is provided on site when resort development or redevelopment occurs. So that kind of sets the tone for the policies that follow. So I'm now going to turn to the actual resort section that we developed, and I believe that is section F. And I'm just scrolling on my screen as well as I'm doing this. I didn't print it out. So section F, I took a stab at it. I wasn't sure when I was going to get to it, but since I'm involved in the Minette process for the township and the district as well, I certainly had a good head start on preparing policies for discussion today. As you all know as well, I was the primary author of the district official plan, and a considerable amount of time and effort was spent during that process on updating the resort policies. So I had draft resort policies I wrote in 2017 that were not endorsed by district council, so they're not in the district plan. And then I had my hand in the Minette policy framework as well. And what I essentially did is I took what I think is the best of both of those and put them together in this particular section for discussion purposes. And so what I'm going to do now is explain where various elements of this section came from and why they're in here. So again, as with every other section in the official plan, a series of objectives is where this section starts, and it deals specifically with resort commercial development. So it's a little bit more focused than just tourism. It's focused on resort commercial uses. So again, whole series of objectives. Again, objectives are not policies. They're intended to set the tone for the policies that follow. And of course, they start off by recognizing resorts as a vital component of the tourism industry, provides an historic link to the origins of tourism in Muskoka Lakes. B, again, gets at encouraging development and redevelopment that demonstrates sustainable economic, social, and environmental practices. C, support resort development and redevelopment in all designations through flexible policies which accommodate changing market demands. That was something we came up with through the district process. We recognized that not every resort is different. Every property is different. Every context is different. So there is a need for some flexibility in terms of how resorts are actually delivered or enhanced. D, of course, is ensuring that existing and new resorts are commercial in nature. That's always been a discussion item in the township and district. So that's clearly where we're starting from. E, protect environmentally sensitive areas and ensure that where development is permitted, its design and construction is done in a manner that limits site disturbance, protects natural features and functions, protects tree canopy, and so on. And I believe, if I recall correctly, that's something that came out of the Minette process. F, ensure that new resorts are appropriately located and developed in a manner that minimizes impacts on the environment and water quality. And lastly, retain existing and viable resort lands to support the continued economic viability or vitality of Muskoka Lakes. So because defining what a resort is and making it clear that it is commercial in nature is important, that's where the policies start from. So section F2 deals with resorts as a commercial enterprise. So the policies in this section are intended to apply to resorts which are considered to be commercial. And they're considered to be distinct from both residential development, seasonal or permanent, and other types of roofed accommodation establishments such as hotels, motels, and bed and breakfast operations. So it goes on to say, for the purpose of this plan, resorts are defined as commercial establishments. They provide roofed accommodations with access to services, facilities, and amenities in a vacation-oriented setting, provide access to a significant natural or human-made tourism asset, and emphasize a recreation experience. And then it goes on to say that in order to ensure that all resorts are planned and used as a commercial enterprise, the terms that are underlined in this section of the plan are defined in section F4. And the definitions I've included within this section come directly from the Minette official plan amendment, and I'll come back to that. Uses permitted in a resort is section F3. So the primary use is lodging, accommodation, recreation, tourism. And the principal permitted uses on a resort property are resort commercial accommodation units as defined, with that definition coming from Minette. And you'll note that later on in this section, E and F, it relates to resort-related residential dwelling units and residential dwelling units. They would not be permitted outside of urban centers. So if you'll recall, in Minette, we have a permission for resort commercial accommodation units and resort-related residential dwelling units and residential dwelling units, because Minette is unique. It's going to be on full services. So you have the three types of accommodation units / dwelling units being permitted. But what we're saying here is that if you're outside of an urban center, the only type of unit you can have is a resort commercial accommodation unit. So those are the units that have to be available for the traveling public in one way or another, and we'll get to the rules under which that could occur. So the secondary permitted uses, of course, are housekeeping, management, staff accommodations, retail and service commercial uses that are functionally integrated into the resort. So you're not necessarily looking for standalone uses that have nothing to do with the resort being permitted in these properties. And of course, uses that promote wellness activities and so on would also be permitted. And I think some of this language actually came from the Minette OPA. So section F4 gets to the I guess the core of how we're going to try to make these things stay commercial. So there are definitions and use restrictions outlined in this section. And I have to say, it's not typical for an official plan to get into this level of detail in terms of how units can be used to ensure that they are commercial in nature. However, in this particular case, and given the many discussions and LPAT hearings on this, I thought it was important to include some very clear direction in the official plan on exactly what we're anticipating. So we have these definitions, and I won't go through them again because I have before in another forum, but they do come directly from the Minette process. We have residential dwelling unit, which is your typical residential dwelling unit. You have a resort to commercial accommodation unit, which could be a unit without kitchen. It could be a self-contained unit in a standalone structure, or it could be a unit in structures with 2 or more units. That definition is exactly the same as Minette. We then have a resort-related residential dwelling unit, means a dwelling unit that forms part of a functionally related integrated resort entity. So the difference between a resort commercial accommodation unit and a resort-related residential unit or dwelling unit, at least in the Minette context, was that resort commercial accommodation units had to be available to the traveling public in some way, and resort-related residential units could be functionally related to the resort, but did not have to be in the rental pool, to make it as simple as possible. And to make it clear, we're not suggesting that resort-related residential dwelling units be permitted in any resort outside of an urban center, and of course, outside of Minette, to be 100% clear. Traveling, vacationing public is also defined. So use restrictions. So this section is essentially the same as what was proposed in Minette. And I do note, if it isn't already known right now, the public meeting on the Minette OPA is actually scheduled for May 28th. So some of these policies will be looked at in that context as well. So what I've done is taken those same policies and included them in here word for word without making any changes. And that is quite frankly because I thought that where that process ended up in terms of establishing that balance between allowing someone to use their unit, but at the same time requiring that unit to be available, I thought was an appropriate balance. And that's based on the unit being used by the owner for a maximum of 26 weeks. And, you know, we can talk about that being 25 and so that it's in the minority, or 26, but it's basically half the year. And a maximum of those 26 weeks can be blocked out by the unit owner in advance. The key, I guess, period of time that everyone seems to focus in on is the summer. So item B deals with those summer months and goes on to say the unit owner is entitled to use the unit for a maximum of 4 weeks during the months of July and August, taken at a period of a minimum of 7 consecutive days. They must be reserved in advance. And for the balance of July and August, the unit must be made available to rent by the resort's mandatory rental pool. So that's a very clear direction on how that's supposed to work. So C, D, and E talks about the unit being in the rental pool a minimum of 26 weeks. There is no minimum use of the unit by the unit owner, and the unit can be in the rental pool for the entire year. And then if the unit is not for rent, there are provisions for the unit owner to occupy the unit for more than 26 weeks. We did have a discussion through the Minette process about what happens if the resorts are not open year round. So we basically applied the same philosophy in terms of the occupancy and use of that resort, with item B being exactly the same in that context, in terms of the unit owner only being able to use the unit for 4 weeks within the months of July and August. I added section F423 at the bottom, because these are very specific provisions, and I didn't want there to be a circumstance where an application is made for a resort and there is a minor change perhaps to how these occupancy restrictions are intended to work on a particular property. Everybody agrees it makes sense. I'm not sure an official plan amendment would be required to change those occupancy provisions. So I added a flexibility clause that basically says they've been included because of the importance of these provisions. But then I say, notwithstanding the above minor modifications to how this all is organized on a case-by-case basis, will not require an amendment to this plan. I think that's probably the best way to go, but my mind is open if folks think that these should be rigid and not modifiable, if I can use that word. So I'm certainly open to any suggestions there. Section F5, new and expanding resorts, again, talks about what the nature of the accommodation permitted, and it clearly sets out, and this is language from the draft district policies I prepared, that resorts are different because they're intended to be different from typical residential development. They benefit from the increased density that comes along with that, but in exchange for getting that increased density, they have to perform certain things, be commercial in nature, and certainly be appropriate for wherever it is being proposed. So again, it reinforces the policy that only resort commercial accommodation units are permitted outside of urban centers. So F5.2 sets out the application requirements. So this is a combination of the draft district policies and the Minette policies. So what we're saying is any application for an amendment to this plan or zoning bylaw to establish a new resort. And then it goes on to say requires all of these studies in addition to a comprehensive development plan in section M10, which I'm also going to talk about in a moment. I guess a key decision to be made, or which could be made, is whether new resorts require just a zoning bylaw amendment or official plan amendment. So that's why I put both of them in there, because I'm not sure what direction we should go on that. But certainly both are Planning Act processes, but one is a little bit more involved than the other. So section B talks about the studies that are needed, and essentially all of the things that need to be addressed in the context of an application. So of course, you're looking at natural heritage, you're looking at lake and hydrological features, you're looking at topography, you're looking at adjacent land uses, you're looking at heritage issues, looking at the recreational carrying capacity. So we do incorporate the recreational carrying capacity policy on smaller bays, and looking at those smaller bays to see if there is the ability to accommodate additional boats and boat traffic. And if those bays, of course, are less than 300 meters wide, looking at the transportation network in the area and nearby wells used for drinking purposes. F5.3 deals with resort development requirements. I'm not going to read all of these, but they are somewhat similar to what we came up in the draft district policies. So there is a need, of course, for resort-related amenities and services. These policies essentially require that in addition to there being the resort commercial accommodation units, there is a need, of course, for a whole bunch of other things to support the resort function. And I certainly anticipate that the discussion on what these are would be different basically on every property, but it's more than just providing a beach and walking trails. So I put that language in at the end to make it clear that we're expecting more than that. We're expecting restaurants, we're expecting wellness facilities, we're expecting other things that really go with a resort, and we don't want just a trail to satisfy that policy. Second one, B, on-site resort management has always been a discussion. However, things are changing. There's a lot of things you can do remotely. So this requires some form of on-site requirement, on-site resort management. However, it depends on the size of the resort and its relationship to other resorts in the area in terms of how that is actually set up, but there is some type of management required to move forward. Thirdly, in item C, there has to be a demonstration that there will be a revenue stream that supports the commercial component of the resort to make sure that they remain viable. Again, that has to be demonstrated when the application is submitted. And then the third thing is all resort development and redevelopment shall do a number of things. So these are actually the criteria that I anticipate council looking at one by one and then making sure they check off each one to make sure that these are being satisfied if an application is made. So the language is quite important in here. And of course, I'm assuming that there will be some suggestions on how it can be enhanced or changed. But here are what I think the criteria should be. And you'll note I use the word shall in this particular section. So it shall meet these things. So if somebody comes in with an application, if they were smart, they would tailor make all of their work to address these conditions. And then council, when it's looking at it, would look at this section and say, okay, you've satisfied these conditions or not when you make a decision. So first one, respecting and be compatible, surrounding environment, no adverse effects on recreational carrying capacity and water quality, minimize disruption to and on existing topography, maintain and improve and or restore health of existing natural amenities such as streams, integrate sustainable development practices, exhibit a high quality built form, locate parking and servicing to the side and rear buildings, minimize disruption to waterfront access and views, reduce conflicts with pedestrians, incorporate landscaping, and then incorporate, where appropriate, 15-meter appropriate vegetative buffers. For those involved in the Minette process, you'll see some of that coming from that Minette OPA. Item E actually comes from the Minette OPA and deals with the architecture and characteristics of major new development, limiting heights and proximity to the shoreline, has to be a low-rise built form, there has to be urban design and or architectural design guidelines completed, dark sky lighting principles should be maintained, allow for the implementation of alternative standards for development where benefits to community character can be demonstrated. So that I guess it allows for some flexibility and how the policies are applied. F deals with all development has to be on a publicly accessible road. Strong linkages to the waterfront shall be developed and dockage shall be provided to accommodate transient visitors arriving by water. And then lastly, staff housing and site will be a condition of development. That has been a key issue historically and something that was incorporated, I believe, in one of the policy directions. So F6 deals with resort-related residential and residential dwelling units. And again, I'll stress that these permissions would only be within urban centers. So they wouldn't apply outside. So again, there are a number of additional conditions layered on in a circumstance where somebody wants those kinds of units within a resort development, again, in the urban center. So some of the language in here comes from Minette. Some of it comes from the draft policies that were prepared in support of the district plan. So it goes on to say, if you're in an urban center, again, all resort-related residential and residential will be parts of a legally and functionally integrated single resort entity. Second one talks about the phasing of resort and tourism amenities. So there needs to be, I guess, the development of these types of accommodation units and the amenities that go along with it have to be in lockstep. In other words, you can't just have all of the units developed without any amenities. It has to go together. I didn't put a percentage in there because that would be a case-by-case discussion. And the idea would be to require a reasonable amount of resort, commercial, and tourism amenities in each phase as appropriate. And I believe that's the same language in the Manette OPA. For those resorts to front on a lake or river, and again, urban centers only, preferred location for majority of resort commercial accommodation units is adjacent to the shoreline, with the other types of units in behind. So somewhat similar to Manette, but not exactly the same. And then lastly, the actual number of resort commercial accommodation units as a percentage shall not be less than 70% of the total number of units. So that's similar to what we did in Manette. But again, this only applies within urban centers. If I recall correctly, there are policies in your plan that allow up to 50% in urban centers at the present time. Section F7 deals with servicing. So it clearly says if you're in an urban center, resorts have to be on full services. That's no surprise. Outside of urban centers, you can have resort commercial units uses and resort commercial accommodation units outside of urban centers on private communal sewage and private communal water. And where these are proposed, they have to go through a condominium process and require as a condition of approval all matters that need to be addressed according to the district. We included item D, which deals with monitoring. And as a condition of approval, regular monitoring of these systems will be required to the satisfaction of the district. And we make it very clear that the full cost of the monitoring is the responsibility of the owner of the services and not a public authority. So the last section deals with conversion of existing resorts. So one of the things that may not be apparent in what I've put together is your current official plan basically indicates that resorts are employment lands as per the definition and identification of such within the provincial policy statement. And I've always wondered why that's the case, but forgetting that for a moment, what it means when you call something employment lands is that in order to change it to something else, you have to convert those employment lands. And there is a specific process laid out in the provincial policy statement to do that. And my thinking is that particularly with the smaller resorts, that just adds another layer of complexity to an application process whereby somebody wishes to convert or change resort use to another use. So this official plan, or at least this draft, does not identify and I guess include resorts as employment lands. So this section is pretty much the same as what I came up with 4 years ago for the district. So it starts off by saying it's the goal of the plan to retain existing resorts wherever possible. That's what everybody certainly wants. But we do recognize in here that there may be desire to convert existing resorts to an alternative use for one or a combination of the reasons below. And so there's limited interest in continuing to operate the resort. We've heard a few stories on that. Prospects for new ownership are limited. Increasing regulatory requirements, particularly with respect to water and sewer services, have been getting more and more rigid all the time. And this has had an impact on the viability of some of the smaller resorts. Significant enhancements are required, and the capital just isn't there to make those enhancements, or occupancy levels have been declining. So these are some of the reasons that we've heard why some folks don't want to continue on with the resorts, the smaller ones that they do have. So then it goes on to say applications to convert will only be supported by the township provided one or more of the following circumstances applies. So it goes on to say environmental, cultural heritage, hazards, or other constraints restrict further development. The provision of appropriate water or sewage services is not possible. In other words, it's very difficult or not possible to enhance or upgrade. The property doesn't have significant holdings or shoreline frontage. And in circumstances where only a portion of the property is proposed to be converted and the part that's proposed to be converted is not physically or functionally accessory to the ongoing operation of the resort. So where a report is required to make those cases, then essentially the author of that report would have to make the case the resort's no longer viable. the other uses that may be permitted on resort property. And in some cases, there are other uses permitted other than resorts on some of these properties are also not viable. The enhancements required to make it viable are just not feasible. And of course, the loss of the commercial land base will not negatively impact the critical mass of tourism infrastructure in the township. And in terms of the alternative use, it has to be demonstrated that whatever is proposed in the alternative, and it may not just necessarily be residential, it could be something else, is appropriate, it's compatible with whatever is happening on adjacent properties, is less impactful on adjacent land uses and the environment than the resort. I think that's important. And will include as a component enhancements to the natural heritage features. So there's a desire for things to be improved if there is to be a conversion. Any application for conversion will require the provision of public access to the shoreline in some form, because it's recognized that some of these resorts provide access to water access lots and island properties, and we want to make sure that that continues to occur. And lastly, should conversion to residential uses be proposed, the form of the development shall be compatible with the scale and nature of adjacent shoreline development. So this is not a way to get higher density residential development on these properties. If they look for residential, it has to be the same character, i.e. frontage and lot area in a general sense, than with what is proposed and exists nearby. So the last piece I wanted to talk about, and then I'll stop, is section M10. And that's further down in the official plan, and I'll just give folks a moment to get there. I could have put this section in the same place, but it didn't fit. So this section is entitled Comprehensive Development Plans. And there was quite a bit of discussion about this through the Minette process. And what this section does is it basically says that where a larger development such as a resort is proposed, they have to do one of these comprehensive development plans that are in support. And these plans have to deal with the environment, water quality, and servicing issues in an integrated manner, which is something I heard loud and clear through the Minette process. It goes on to say, you know, what is considered major development? That's a subjective decision, but anything more, and I've just put a number out there, anything that proposes more than 20 or more accommodation units would be considered major development. Certainly interested in any comments on that. And it goes on to say prior to initiating such a process, terms of reference has to be prepared. Everybody has to be on board before the study is initiated. The study area boundaries have to be agreed to in advance. Any documents and reports prepared have to be done in consultation with the public and will be available for review by the general public. Has to be undertaken by qualified professionals who are recognized in their fields. And then lastly, the comprehensive development plan will include a number of things. It has to look at natural heritage features. It has to identify measures to improve natural heritage and ecosystem functions. It has to look at the approach to development being informed by evaluating features and functions to be maintained and enhanced. Assessments of impacts on heritage and ecosystem, including cumulative impacts, has to identify environmental management techniques, has to look at natural hazards, again, including cumulative impacts and proposed mitigation, has to provide recommendations for long-term management, monitoring requirements and contingency plans, and then of course a statement on overall conformity with the environmental policies of the district official plan and this plan. So there's a lot there, and I wanted to make sure I gave you a fulsome review of what I've done. It's certainly a departure from your existing official plan. I think it provides a lot of detail in terms of what the township's expectations will be in the future. I also think, in my view, that it strikes a balance between wanting to ensure that whatever happens is appropriate for the lake and its setting, while at the same time providing a path for resorts to be proposed and or redeveloped. So I'm looking forward to hearing any comments or questions on that. Thank you very much, Chair Bridgeman.
Okay, thank you, Mr. McDonald. Councillor Zavitz.
Well, thank you, and through you, Chair, to Nick, although great presentation so far, and of course, you've been carrying the weight of this. You mentioned right near the end, made in, this is essentially a made in Township of Muskoka Lakes official plan. This is for us, and I guess when as the very beginning of your presentation, what I always look for, to define the word resort. What is a resort? Is there is there a minimum number of rooms, et cetera? And I bring this up because as we're looking for a made in this township solution, I mean, we have situations now where people can rent a 10-bedroom cottage on Airbnb, and that is certainly has a residential designation. It doesn't have a commercial designation. So I would ask you, Nick, if I might, through the chair, is there any benefit or value to actually naming the resorts circa 2021 that are, I mean, do we go that far? You talked earlier about how this is a deeper dive than perhaps we were considering, but so I don't want to mind mess this thing to death, but do we name the actual resorts as of right now? I mean, what defines a resort? And I could name some of them, but I couldn't name all of them because some of them are only open seasonally. And is there a sub-criteria for open 24/7, 365 versus 6 months versus residential habitation by a group of people that slips underneath our radar?
That's a great question because things have gotten a lot fuzzier in recent years, particularly with Airbnb and so on. I can tell you, and perhaps Mr. Pink can jump in, but the resorts in your township are all zoned in particular zones that identify them as resorts. So there already is a division in terms of where, not a division, there already is to a very large extent a clear identification of what is a resort and what is not a resort through your existing zoning bylaw. I'd ask Mr. Pink to comment on that.
Mr. Pink?
Thank you, Chair. Through you. Yes, I was, further Mr. McDonald's comments, I was going to say the same thing. Our resort properties are zoned. There's actually not that large an amount of them. I think we had some brief informational updates, I recall, in the relatively recent past, and there's certainly a reasonable amount of resorts where we could likely identify or name them in a database, not with too much trouble, but they are, and I think the district has been undertaking that type of research across the district, but the current existing resorts do have typically a waterfront commercial zoning assigned to them, which would identify them.
Thank you. Member Thompson. Lori?
Okay. Hi, thank you. And thank you, Nick, for that very comprehensive explanation of where everything came from. I have 2 questions, and then I have a number of comments to make. I'll just do some overview comments first. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this resorts issue. I was on the Minette Joint Policy Review Steering Committee where we did a really deep dive into the resorts issue. And so I do have some overview comments that I would like to make, if that's okay. And I'm not sure the right process for me to factor in my my specific comments for each of the policies, because I have lots of those as well. So perhaps this is not the right forum for that, so I'll just stick to the overarching comments to begin with. But first of all, my 2 questions. The first question is, to what extent did the work of the Minette Joint Policy Review Steering Committee factor into the objectives and the policies that you wrote? I know that the Minette work, that group morphed into a group that worked with the developers in coming up with the Minette draft policy. But there were some of the Minette Joint Policy Review Steering Committee's recommendations were watered down a little bit in that draft. And so I'm wondering, to what extent did our recommendations as our committee factor into this plan?
All right, that's a great question through Chair Bridgeman, and I guess where I came into that process is after some of that discussion between the consultant and the developer ensued, and then I looked at that and I enhanced it and in my view improved it, with that being the launching point. So I didn't go back in time to before that in terms of figuring out what to do next. In the end, I'm still looking at it from a good planning perspective and from, applying good planning principles to the approach. And I think that where we all collectively ended up in Minette is not a bad starting point. So that was my launching point for this as well.
Okay, so I suppose then through the process, there will probably be people recommending that you go back to look at the Minette recommendations and just make sure that the good stuff, all the good stuff from those recommendations, make it into this plan, because the township and the district spent some money on that committee, and we did come up with, we spent 2 years looking at recommendations, and so I would just hope that they would be adequately reflected in the policy that we send out to the public. So that's my first question. My second question is the Altus Consulting Group did a waterfront economy study, and that was part of our Minette steering committee work. And they came up with a series of recommendations for resorts in the district. And I'm wondering to what extent their recommendations were factored into this work, because again, there seem to be some differences there.
I guess in a nutshell, I continue to believe personally, as a planner, that resorts are a positive thing in the district and a positive thing in the township, and I do support resort and development and redevelopment. I certainly am aware of what the Altus study said in terms of what it thought would be the potential for demand for new resorts and so on going forward. To be honest, I'm not convinced that their conclusions are exactly bang on. This form of development is very dependent on people making all kinds of decisions that really can't be anticipated in advance, in my view. Mm-hmm. And now we've got a COVID circumstance where people are now making all kinds of life decisions that people wouldn't have thought of 2-3 years ago. So in the end, the policies I've prepared recognize that there are existing properties that can be redeveloped, and I believe there will continue to be demand for new properties. But what these policies do is they try to balance all of the various factors together to ensure that there is a process and a path to be followed when someone wishes to go down this road. That's much better than just saying no. And it's much better than just saying yes. I really think we've ended up in the middle here and said, here is your path. It's a pretty tough path. I mean, these policies are not easy ones to satisfy. And the intent here is, if somebody wants to take a go at it, here's what you got to do and make your application.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Just to let committee know, for those of you who have not looked at the Altus Waterfront Economy Study, they predicted demand for a net additional 270 resort rooms in the entire district over the next 25 years. That's the entire district. Minette could provide up to 1,000, maybe 2,000 units, although some of those will be residential. So resort units, maybe 600 or 800. And there's lots of capacity coming on stream in Huntsville as well as some in Gravenhurst. And so I think we have to question what will be driving the demand of these units. If Altus is right, if there's not going to be significant demand for people to come up and stay in a resort-like accommodation, a significant additional demand to what we already have, and we do know that there is quite a bit of vacancy across the district in these resorts. So that if that is the case, then what would be driving the demand for these units? And as I see it, I think it's important for us to keep in mind that the building of these resorts is not going to be driven by the demand for tourists. The new resorts will likely be built under the condo model. All the resort developers are telling us this. Each unit will be purchased by a unit owner, just like a cottage. And so the building of these units will be driven by the demand by people for this type of cottage in Muskoka. And I understand that there's a rental pool that they need to go in, so there's that commercial aspect. But the way the rental pool is currently written, an owner of one of these units can use it for May, June, July, September, October, come back for Christmas, put it in the rental pool for August to cover their taxes and their condo fees, and then stay in the unit at any point in time during August if it's not being rented out. And we're calling that commercial, and maybe that is commercial, and maybe that's fine. But I would imagine that there'll be significant demand for this type of product. And so if it's profitable for the developers to build and sell this type of product, then they will likely build and sell as much as we allow them to build and sell. The Altus study did caution that given the limited additional demand, that building a lot of additional capacity will create a more challenging business environment for resort incumbents and for new players. And particularly more challenging environment for the old traditional resorts that need full occupancy in the summer to survive. So this, putting on new capacity will, hurt the traditional hoteliers and render vacancy rates across the district even higher than they are now. And maybe that's okay. Maybe everything is going to go the way of the condominium resort. But I think we do need to recognize that they're not being built by hoteliers, but by developers who earn their investment by selling the units. They're not by operating a resort or a hotel. In most cases, they're not going to stay around to run the hotel, but they'll pass it along to a management company or a condo corporation. This works, and it's great if it's a Marriott with a real hotel with real facilities, the restaurant, the spa, the creating employment. But in the case of a Legacy Cottages or a Villas of Muskoka, the resort manager is basically a booking agent, and then a person hired to run the front desk, and maybe someone to come and clean the pool once a week. They're not creating a lot of employment, and there's I'll make one more point, and then I'll reserve some of my more specific comments for later. But these units are the whole rationale and premise behind allowing these resort units to have additional density is that they are going to bring the traveling and vacationing public to Muskoka, and that they're going to create jobs. I mean, that was initially part of that's why they're called employment lands. And so if they're not creating jobs, ironically, the unintended consequences of encouraging this resort model are that they may put the traditional resorts out of business. They may not create the intended jobs we want. They may be built despite the fact that there's little demand for them, and given the high demand for cottages. And I think we need to determine as a municipality how many of these we want to have built around our lakes, because chances are it's going to be profitable for developers to build them and sell them, and we may not like the results.
Okay. Ms. Thompson?
Yes.
Councillor Kelly.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Bridgeman. Really good job on this, Nick. I think you picked up a lot of real issues that have, been obvious through our history with LPAT on this commercial resort. I've got basically three headers, like Member Thompson. I've got some specifics, but I'll just touch on the headers so we can either have a discussion or I can send the specifics in later. I want to also pick up on two comments that have already been made, and one was from Member Zavitz. If you pour through the Airbnb listings or Jane's Cottages, it's obvious that there are a lot of units out there that are on almost permanent short-term rental. And the only reason I mention it is if you look at some of the definitions that are included in this draft OP, I think there may be an unintended consequence that we are scooping up those units, some of those units, and making them subject to this when we either don't want to, or maybe we do want to. It's just, I think we need to start thinking about, or think carefully about some of these definitions about whether they actually pick up things we didn't intend, like short-term rentals. Number two, Member Thompson mentioned the shoreline economic activity and 250 units, of growth. One of the responsibilities I think we have in regulating the development of commercial resorts, we talk a bit about commercial viability of the existing resorts. I think it's only fair to existing resorts that we look at what the all this additional growth does to the possible failure of people who've been doing this for a long time. Every time you add a new unit, you cheapen the product. And the poor people at Shamrock and Sherwood and some of the other places that have been working hard to develop a resort economy suffer, in the background a little bit because we've been a little too willing to let new resort development happen. So 3 areas, real quick. Actually, I've already touched on one of them. One of the issues that we've run into, certainly Legacy at LPAT, some of the others, is our inability to determine whether there's actual compliance. And so I would like to see, and maybe it doesn't belong in the OP, I think it does. I would like to see an actual record that the burden of proof is on the resort, is on the developer. The burden of proof that this is actually a commercial operation going forward is theirs to carry, not ours to prove. And that means that they need to give us access to books and records. We have to have opportunity to talk and ask questions. I would also like to see things that, establish a traditional relationship like a resort, common furnishings. Putting them in the rental pool is one thing, but if they're in the rental pool and I establish my own rate and I make it so prohibitively expensive that nobody rents it, it's not really in the rental pool. So things like that to establish an actual commercial resort operation going forward, I think is important. The last comment I have is, and I like the idea that we've baked in here that there's a kind of a test of commercial viability. The problem I have is I don't know how that ever could be established in a pro forma basis for something that's still a concept. And no offense to anyone on our staff, there's a skill to interpreting those kind of financial statements and reviewing and assessing the underlying assumptions that I just don't think we have here. So I think we could solve the problem by simply having access to whatever records the resort, the proposed development has put to its financial backers, whether they're private equity, whether they're bankers. They're tearing into it, they're assessing the risk, they're questioning the assumptions. And I think if it's good enough for the bankers, it probably ought to be good enough for us, but we should have access to the same information and we should not have to kind of figure out how to assess it on our own. And I guess the subheader to that is, we've seen all sorts of chicanery and head fakes on resort development. So the notion that somebody can build a residential resort hotel, a commercial resort hotel, and have it somehow perform at a substandard level for a couple of years and then seek to have it downgraded and turned back into a residence is a bit too convenient. Bankruptcy is the great leveler. If you can't make it work at your investment, somebody else can pick it up out of bankruptcy and maybe make it work at less. And I just want to make sure that section doesn't become kind of a mid to long-term strategy for a developer who wants to build something in the guise of a commercial resort that handily enough fails and gets turned back into residential. But otherwise, great work. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Hayes.
Thank you, and through you, a lot of what I was going to mention has already been stated, but under F6A, resort-related residential and residential dwelling units, it says that they may be permitted in urban centers. I am under the impression that our urban centers are Port Carling and Bala, and Minette is a tourist resort area. Are we redefining Minette to an urban center, or should that say urban centers and tourist resort areas?
Quick response. No, we're not redefining Minette as an urban center. That would be a no-win for a lot of people if we went down that road. No, so good point. Minette is being dealt with separately. It's a special policy area. It's considered to be a settlement area. So no, we're not trying to reclassify that, but your point's well taken. We will at some point have to incorporate the Minette policies in the official plan. And when that happens, there will be some wording improvements and enhancements to make everything clear. But we're not reclassifying Minette through this process.
Councillor Hayes, you're good. Okay, Member Arnie.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, Chair, to clarify, the current resorts are identified in zoning, but David said waterfront commercial. Now, I'm looking at a lot of our small resorts, which would not meet the definition of a resort as it's presented in this document. Excuse me. So F5 is entitled New and Expanding Resorts. I really don't feel anything in these policies has made accommodation for a Sherwood or Shamrock to enhance. And I think if they looked at this, they would be defeated before they started. So first, I just like clarification. Is there a waterfront commercial resort zone? I don't remember it, I'm sorry. And secondly, ensure that the current resorts or accommodation providing waterfront areas aren't faced with these kinds of restrictions if they want to enhance their properties and their services going forward. Strictly, first of all, I mean, they can't provide on-site staff accommodation, probably. Thank you.
Through you, Chair Bridgeman, I'll start off and then I'll ask Mr. Pink to comment on the zoning piece. Great question. These policies are predicated on a proponent wanting to go through a condominium model approach. Basically, they want to create units that are to be sold to individual entities. And when that is proposed, what is the township's response and what are the rules around that? These other older resorts are not condominiums, and they may want to expand in any way they want to expand. And if they're not following that condominium model, then a lot of these policies really don't apply to them, because these expansions are intended to provide additional accommodation, additional units for the traveling public. You raise a good point, because my focus up until now has been on those proposals that are going through that condominium process, and not as much time has been spent thinking about those existing resorts that may wish to expand. So something for us to think about collectively, but certainly the focus of all the LPAD hearings and all of the discussion has been on the condominium model and how that is to be dealt with. And that's where all the fights have been. So that's clearly where the focus has been. But you raise a good point. Mr. Pink, do you have a comment on the zoning question?
Mr. Pink.
Thank you, through the chair. Hopefully this helps explain, but I'm happy to clarify if you have looking for more specifics. We have a number of waterfront commercial zones, anything that allow a specific zone that allows a marina, some that allow waterfront contractor yards. And then we also have a number of waterfront commercial zones that allow a tourist resort, as well as hotels and motels, and then allow a myriad of accessory uses if you establish a tourist resort, such as a spa, retail, convenience, those types of amenities, restaurant, tavern, etc. And as I mentioned earlier, the existing resort properties along our waterfront are put into those categories, including Shamrock Lodge and the others that you mentioned. So I hope that helps clarify. But again, if I'm misunderstanding the question, I'm happy to provide further details.
No further, Chair Burgess, if I may.
Yes,
Thank you,
please go.
David. That clarifies it. Nick, I appreciate and certainly understand that's where the focus is. It isn't clear in this document that is where the focus is, or the intent. And I really do feel that redevelopment, I think there are things that we could do to ensure that our existing resorts don't feel threatened or overwhelmed by this. Thank you for your tolerance.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Clark, Member Clark.
I'm going to keep this as brief as possible because I think I'm going to defer all my time to Frank. I think this is his moment. So, and I think he spent a lot of time on it. Clearly, a lot of you have spent a lot of time on it. I'm actually a member of Friends of Muskoka because of these issues. And I live in the Bay next to the Marriott and next to the new development in Minette. So without getting into a lot of personal thoughts, just the practical side of it really quickly, which I'm just making sure people have checked the boxes, because from a real estate side, what I can tell you is I've been called into multiple small resorts. Most of them, lots of them are looking for different uses, different opportunities, because they're not viable. They really don't have enough income to provide adequate upkeep. Their demand because of that is dropping dramatically. Just frankly, people don't want to come up to Muskoka and have a $30 hamburger and sit in rooms that haven't been refurbished. And I think Cleveland's House was a pretty good example of that. I mean, it's really gone into disrepair significantly over the years. I don't plan on getting into all of this because I think lots of you have. But when I take a look at smaller resorts, they're probably going to have to convert to residential at some point. I mean, they have a loyal old group of people that go to them, and that's what I get told. It's almost like farmers turning their land to residential. They're poor their whole life, and then when they can convert it back to, when they can convert it to residential lands, they're multimillionaires. So that I don't see that changing with all of these requirements. I mean, I don't see anybody being able to open a resort and not have impact on RCC, and when they have to build on-site staff housing and all of those types of things, those are all non-revenue generating opportunities. I can tell you one of my favorite places to go in the winter is the Marriott because nobody's there. So the majority of these properties are sitting vacant for 6 to 8 months. I think the majority of all of us have been business people. I don't know how you run a business that only has viable income for 4 months. But, people keep trying to do that up here. So I agree with Peter and I agree with Lori. Maybe there is some sort of hidden agenda to all of this, but I can't imagine any of the people that I deal with or talk to got up and said, how do I start a business that I can take to bankruptcy in the next 3 to 4 years? I mean, that just sounds a bit ludicrous, all for the purposes of trying to transition it. I will say, one of my biggest challenges was 4 years ago, trying to find proper accommodation for a wedding that we had on our property. And when you start looking at what's available for resorts, it's incredibly limited. And I think one of our, again, I'll defer to Peter. I think one of our bigger revenue opportunities as a township and what we have to offer is tourism. And yet, maybe we should do a tour of what's available out there. My last comment would be, and again, it's just from a real estate perspective and a business perspective. We get an opportunity to list a lot of these properties that are available to the traveling public. And what I'm going to say to you is the Marriott has followed the plan of condominiumizing. Rocky Crest has followed the plan of condominiumizing. Touchstone has followed the plan of condominiumizing. It isn't viable for an owner. They buy these places at $400,000 or $500,000, $800,000. We can't sell them for $100,000. I mean, take a look at a Rocky Crest model of what somebody paid for a Rocky Crest model and what 5 weeks is worth today. Phil, you're probably seeing it too. I mean, you're lucky to get 50 grand. These people paid $350,000, $400,000 for these properties. They're losing their shirts, and frankly, they can't get out of it because of the condo fees and the cost of common areas. So I would say if we want to figure out it, first of all, if we want resorts, we should, hopefully somebody went and talked to the Muskokan, because whatever they're doing there, they're the only ones that have figured out, at least from an economic point of view, how to make it work. And I don't know if their model would still work if we had imposed all of the criteria that I'm sure are very well thought out and everybody spent lots of time discussing. But I can't imagine when they've got 80 something units in there that RCC wouldn't, how could they say, oh my God, we didn't have any adverse effect of that day? And if they had to put staff housing on there, would that have worked? So, I mean, just my comments from the practical point of view, I mean, the small guys can't seem to live or upgrade their facilities, and the big guys can't fill them. So I guess we got to ask, do we want these things or not? And otherwise, I don't know how you make them viable, but I don't think there's anyone that's viable. And the only one I can think of is the Muskokan. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Clark. And I know that it's about half the value when you try to sell one of those units too. So they do drop. Mayor Harding?
Thank you. And just to echo Bob's comments to start, even the Muskokan, those people who purchased there are having a hard time getting out or getting their money out if they want. It's decreased, I'm going to say, the least of all, but certainly a difficult business model to be in. I'm going to go back to Patricia's comments, and interesting as we look through this resort commercial, I honestly didn't realize these are specifically written for condo use agreement type commercial developments. And I know we can't regulate or talk about the ownership, but if we're writing policies around a specific set of ownership, maybe we should specifically call these condo developments as opposed to commercial, and really try and regulate them. Let's call a spade a spade. And to the point, what are we doing to help the existing resorts? Shamrock isn't struggling because the Marriott was built. Shamrock is struggling, and they were struggling long before the Marriott was built, because of a change in market, the way people come up here. And I'm fortunate. I made my living for 10 years working in the resort industry right across Ontario. But every single resort that I operated a waterfront at has changed drastically. No longer are the families coming up for 7 days or 14 days, signing up to the American meal plan, putting their kids in rec programs, and spending their entire 14 days on the resort property. That's why Cleveland's House got into disrepair. 20 years ago, those resort properties like Shamrock, everything, literally at the end of this summer would have been 95% sold out for next summer. Pretty much any given weekend, you can find a hotel room available in Muskoka within 24 hours notice right now. So I buy into the growth comments, but I think the nature of tourism, which we still are holding and waving this big banner that we have to promote tourism, has changed drastically. And it is the blurred lines between, is it a cottage rental? Is that a commercial entity, or is it a resort rental? So I'm struggling. We have a policy here in F1F that talks about new resorts. Nobody's coming and taking my waterfront recreational property up front and trying to create a new resort and rezone it. Nobody's building a new resort. the only thing they're doing is redeveloping a resort, I get it. But that's because they're stuck in an area and they're trying to make economic sense. Any resort redevelopment, the Marriott, again, used to be Peyton House, excuse me, years beforehand. There's all just new names, but it's the same property. Muskoka Sands, now Taboo, the only way they made money was they would close for renovations in the wintertime because their staff, they couldn't afford to pay them. What they made through June through September, they bled in November and December, maybe opened up for a couple of weeks in the wintertime. So it's a totally different market, and we need to understand that. I'll make a quick comment about F53, and that's staff housing, and that a requirement that it must be there. I think Bob made the comment, somebody like a Villas of Muskoka, they have no room to put staff and define, does every staff that has to work on the resort property have to live on that property at the same time? So it's a difficult imposition to put. We realize that we have a large employer like the Marriott that has staff accom everywhere, but so does every golf course. So does every property maintenance company. So does every restaurant. All have staff issues and accommodation issues. So it's difficult, again, in this broad condo use policy to say any staff that works there has to live on site. So I struggle with that. The one area that I think we need some more enhancements on, and that is F8B, and that's the conversion of resorts. There are a number of resorts today that, again, we're trying to hold on to this economic policy because it's all tourism, it's all great. The biggest economy we happen to have in Muskoka is not the tourism industry, it's the construction industry. People are still coming up here, but the traditional tourism industry is changed drastically. So I wonder whether or not why we hold on to these potential downgrading of resorts and compounding the issues for those that want to make an economically viable resort. So you take a Shamrock property, if we actually made it a little bit easier for them potentially to downgrade their resort. And when we talk about downgrade, I think we need to be very specific that if there's a change in use, it's quote unquote a downgrade. Certainly not increased densities. Must increase a lower density in whatever that downgrade would be if you're going to take away some employment lands. Call it a lesser zone, you know, and many of our commercial properties have rights associated with development rights of 500 units per acre or whatever it may be. And we need to find something significantly lower for that downgrade. I think that's appropriate to look in these kind of senses and this official plan. So I'll leave my kind of comments at that. But I would like to really look at commercial development. Maybe there's a condo development and there's a commercial resort redevelopment policy that would help those if they do want a redevelopment. So.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Jaglowitz.
Thank you, Chair, and I certainly appreciate Mr. Clark lending some of his time to me. First of all, I'd like to compliment Nick in particular and staff in general and consultants for taking a stab at this section. I think it was a bold move, and I think it came close to the mark. It's not perfect, but I think it was an excellent start. I'm going to reverse what the others have done. I have 2 or 3 detailed points on what's here, and then I'm going to go into the overall after, if that's okay. So my first detail comment is, if you go to F52, and you don't necessarily have to go there, but Nick, you've used some bolded text there. Can I assume that doesn't have any meaning? I know you've got underlying text, it's a definition. Does the bolded text mean anything, or is it just a slip of the word processor?
Quick response. Anything that's in bolded text is actually a defined term at the, I guess, the back at the OP. So natural heritage features and areas is a term that is in the provincial policy statement, so it's defined. Ecological functions is also defined. And then you'll see in item 5, significant built heritage resources and all those other terms are also defined terms as well. And I believe I mentioned right at the outset of all of these meetings that there is a definition section in the official plan, and we made an effort to make sure that wherever something was defined, we bolded it. So it's still a bit uneven. The second draft will be perfect in that regard, but that's what the idea there is.
So the bolded text is defined in the PPS or somewhere. The underlined text is the definition in this plan. That's why.
Yeah. So good question. So I had to come up with a way of differentiating between the defined terms at the end and the 4 defined terms we have in this section. So the underlined words are just defined in this section, and they only relate to this section. If it's bolded, it applies everywhere it's bolded. So natural heritage features and areas are dealt with in other sections of the plan too.
And so when urban center is defined, which there's already been a question, that'll be either bolded or underlined. Anyway, just to clarify that to make it easier to read. If we go to F5, 3, B and H, and that's the section where you introduced a lot of the word shall. Okay, you said shall, and the only place you weren't consistent was in H, where you used the term will. In other words, you said shall on everything, but when you got to staff housing, you said will. Does shall and will the same thing?
Shall and will are the same thing, and I commit to you that wherever I've used will, I'll change it to shall, just so there is no confusion going
Okay,
future.
that's fine. So if we go to F7C, and there we're talking about servicing now, and you talk about where private communal services are only allowed with a condominium description. And I'd like you to rethink that if you don't mind, because we know that the urban centers have municipal services, so that makes sense that they're on public services. But there's a section I believe you should be allowing private communal services for a resort that's not on public services, and I think a good example of that may be the redevelopment of Cleveland's house. It hasn't, in my understanding, it has not been decided that will proceed by way of condominium. And therefore, I think that there should be a provision if someone wants to operate a fairly large resort where there are no private public services, they should be allowed on private services as long as it's not residential. So just want you to rethink that if you don't mind. When we get to section F8, there's been a lot of discussion about it, and I agree, Nick, with your concept of resorts are important to Muskoka and the whole district. And I believe that we should not be encouraging the downzoning of those lands. I think those lands, if we downzone them, we'll never get them again. And they should be held there for some developer to come or some new concept to come to redevelop them. There are some obvious incidences where their downzoning may be appropriate, but I don't think, as some member mentioned, I certainly don't hope it wouldn't be something that a developer looks at, that he'll start it off and then downzone it. Then we get to my more general nature, and that is that I know that this section talks about resorts, and then there's going to be a section on Manette. And I know the history of how that occurred, but as you recall, that created difficulty during the recent LPAT hearing at the district. I'd strongly ask you to look at the concept of having the resort section apply to all resorts in the township. And where Manette is different, to have the exceptions there, as opposed to having it its own section. Because the problem is, and then this is what happened at the LPAT hearing, we may have a very good phrase in the general sections that tries to protect something, and if it isn't replicated properly in the minutes section, it doesn't apply. And I know you've done it this way because of this first draft, and I understand, but when you weave in Minette, I would much prefer that you made the Minette section much smaller and had the general sections apply to Minette and then pointed out where they're different. I think it would be easier for everybody to understand. Another just comment, and then Minette has, or the Marriott has been mentioned throughout this discussion. And I believe the Marriott is an example of a hotel that operates there. And I know it's had its difficulties, but it might be interesting for you to know that it turned a profit in 2020 during COVID. So there is hope here. Okay, there are ways of doing things. So I think we should be encouraging a strong resort sector and discouraging the residential use in those areas. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. McDonald, should we do a 10-minute break now and then we'll come to their next questions?
Yeah, that would be a great idea, Chair Bridgeman.
Okay, so it is 10:30. We're all back at 22:11. So if we can get everybody back, please. Okay, I think we'll carry on. Lori, are you back yet? There you are. Okay, you're next.
Yes, I'm back and I'll unmute myself. Thank you very much. I just want to pick up on a couple of comments that others made, as well as make a couple of specific policy suggestions. With respect to a comment that that Peter Kelly made concerning assessing the commercial viability of these properties, the resorts that are being built under the new condominium model will be financially viable with a revenue stream from the condo management fees from the owners, not from guests. That condo management fees will cover the cost of the property manager, the person to come in to clean the pool, the common area maintenance. And so essentially, these new units will be residential condos with a requirement to rent them out to the traveling vacation public for a period of time. And that's where the commerciality is derived from that rental pool. The commerciality is not derived from the viability of the entity itself, because a residential condo that has no requirement to rent out its units is commercially viable based on the manager itself is commercially viable based on the revenue stream that it gets from the condo management fees. And so I see these as being quite similar to that sort of situation. So to use a commercial viability test as a test of commerciality, I'm not sure will really apply to these units. And I guess I'm interested in a comment from Mr. McDonald on what he thinks about that, given that this is a new model of ownership and has a different economic structure to a regular resort that's 100% owned by the hotelier, who actually needs to have the traveling and vacationing public come in order to make a profit.
A quick response through you, Chair Bridgeman, is when I think of commercial viability, I think of the ability of the resort to sustain the resort-related amenities and the supporting activities that are occurring on the property, like a wellness center, a restaurant, recreational facilities, and so on. I know there's been lots of discussion about commercial viability on a unit-by-unit basis and on a collective basis. I'm looking at it on the collective basis. I want to make sure that whatever is proposed has amenities associated with it, and those amenities are sustainable in whatever form they take and what they are. And of course, different size and different scaled resorts will have different types of amenities. So it's very difficult to predict in advance exactly what they are, but they have to be sustainable economically for this to remain commercial. That's the basic idea.
Okay, so I see that as working where you have amenities as being a real test of commerciality, where you have amenities that are commercial themselves, like the restaurant and the wellness center. But where you have an amenity like a pool or tennis courts and the beach and a fire pit and those things that would be covered by the condominium management fees, that they're basically common areas for the use of all of the owners. I don't see that as being a test of commerciality. And so for the smaller resorts that will not be able to viably have a restaurant or a wellness center, I think that's going to be a difficult test for the township to apply, to say that, yes, they tick this box on being commercial, because none of those elements, none of those amenities are actually commercial amenities. They're amenities that you would equally find at a residential condominium resort complex. I won't call it a resort because it's not really a resort. So I just, keep that in mind, because I think that the proponents, I know that the proponents of these units or these properties will argue that their units are commercial by this definition, because they can operate as an ongoing entity based on the condo management fees. We ran into that issue with in the villas hearing. So that's one comment I wanted to make, and I'd just like to turn to the policy set for a minute, if you don't mind. Under the definitions, F4.1, I know that the draft Minette definition of an accommodation unit included a maximum square footage of 850 square feet per unit. I'm wondering why it was left out of this, because if I look at a unit that has a kitchen and 3 bedrooms, I could have a kitchen, 3 bedrooms, a study, a den. This could be a 3,000 square foot unit, and that would be equivalent to a unit in unit terms as a unit that's 850 square feet. And so if we are going to be limiting density on these properties by number of units, then I think that perhaps we need to look at the unit size as a limiting factor as well.
Just a quick comment on that.
Sure.
I did deliberately not include a cap. My thinking was, and certainly this is a first draft, the process of Minette resulted in there being agreement, and I'll use the word very loosely, on the total package of development, and that was then translated into floor area, floor space, and density. So it was a very specific process that led to the development of a very specific number. And I wasn't sure that was what should be applied in every case. And if you think about it, if there is no cap and the units are larger, you actually have a lesser number of units. So that might satisfy other interests as well in terms of density too. Having said that, my mind is certainly open to including something in there that suggests that there should be a cap, but perhaps with it not being set out in advance. But something to think about clearly when we prepare the next draft of it. But that's the rationale for not including it in this draft here.
Okay, and so what would
Laurie, just
Yes.
sorry, no, I'm sorry, interrupt, but I think Mr. Pink would like to also speak to that before we move on. So, Mr. Pink.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to mention, it's a bit technical, but with respect to the zoning bylaw, the reason unit equivalencies and a unit cap are so important in Minette, it's only in our communities and our urban centers where the zoning bylaw limits a unit count on resorts. And there's not many. Obviously, Minette is the main resort village. There's not that many resorts in our other communities. In the waterfront commercial area, which is in our waterfront designation, which is the vast majority of our resorts, there is no unit limitation in our zoning bylaw. There's an overall gross floor area limitation in our zoning bylaw, dependent on the amount of acreage. So it functions essentially as a unit cap. If you're going to build larger units, you're going to reach your GFA maximum, and vice versa. If you build smaller units, you may be permitted more of them. So it works fairly well for the vast majority of resorts. And I think I've mentioned this before in the very contentious Minette discussions. That's what a lot of the concern is, and it's a function of the zoning bylaw that allows such a large unit count in Minette because it's a settlement area. But that doesn't apply to the rest of the township. And also, just quickly, I think you echoed a lot of my thoughts in the earlier discussion, and I just wanted to chime in quickly because a lot of the discussion surrounds or has been revolving around the rental pool requirements and the number of weeks. I'm a firm believer also in the commerciality that to me, the resort really has to look and smell and feel like a resort to be a resort. And the piece we don't spend enough time talking about are those other amenity areas, and requiring that accessory restaurant, retail components, spa, pool, those amenities, so that yes, there may be some private owner use of the units, at least in the public's eyes and others like the JW Marriott, it is functioning more like a hotel or a resort because of those amenities. And I turn everyone's attention to F53A. That was our attempt to be a little more clear on that. And it talks about something a little more tangible than just, I have a beach and a walking trail. And I put your mind a little bit whether we hit the right balance there. I recognize there are comments, and I agree completely. I think there needs to be an element of sustainability to that, and also an element that some smaller resorts, that may not be a viable option. So there needs to be some flexibility built in. But on larger resort redevelopments, I think we need to be a little more firm on requiring those amenities. Sorry, it slipped my mind, but just quickly flipping back to the unit size. As I mentioned, I think the zoning bylaw with limiting GFA largely addresses the concern. But what committee may wish to discuss is if you do want sort of an overall cap. If you feel a 5,000 square foot unit at a resort is excessive, you may want to have some discussion around that if there's sort of an overall limit. But I think the market, as we've talked about, in my experience, and I look to others, but there's certainly a demand. Longer past are the days where a family will come up and stay in a small hotel room for a week. There is a demand for 2-3 bedroom detached units at our resorts. And I wouldn't want to handcuff the industry, but you may want to put your mind to an overall cap. So I hope those comments provide a bit of background and help the discussion.
Thank you. Okay, sorry, Laurie, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Can I ask another question following on from that then? If, say, at Camp Frenda, that's up around the corner from Minette, they've got 65 acres of property, and they have 1,800 feet of shoreline. And so it's the same amount of shoreline as Cleveland's house, and it's the same amount of acreage as the whole waterfront area, lakeside of Judhaven Road in Minette. If they came along and said, you know what, our camp doesn't work anymore, it's no longer viable as a camp, we're a commercial property, we would like to build a resort, and we would like to build a whole bunch of 5,000 square foot cottages, or 3,000 square foot cottages, or whatever it is, and they will be resorts, and we'll put them in a rental pool, and don't worry about it. We've already heard that it's difficult to monitor and enforce these rental pool requirements. There's other municipalities that have had challenges with this and just given up on the whole rental pool idea. Innisfil is one of them. What is to prevent someone from coming in with a Camp Frenda property, or there's several others around the lake, and saying, this is what I want to do? Do we have a density limitation that's going to prevent them from doing that? They're on a large open waterway on Lake Rosso, so they would not be violating any recreational carrying capacity limits. Are we happy that they would come and do this? I'm struggling a bit because I don't think we fully recognize the implications of allowing this type of model to go ahead without specific restrictions on what can be built.
A quick response to that, and if we could predict how we would look at every property, we'd be very wealthy indeed. One of the challenges here is that every property is very unique, and to a very large extent, what these policies are designed to do is to allow for that site-specific assessment to derive what is appropriate on a property-by-property basis. There will be limitations from an environmental perspective, a servicing perspective, topography, water resources, lake capacity. There may be all kinds. There needs to be a review of all of these things in determining what's appropriate. So the densities on various properties may be different based on that context. Having said that, giving some consideration to what an appropriate density is, perhaps with reference or the starting point being the zoning bylaw, may be a good idea. I haven't turned my mind to that. But part and parcel of the challenge we have here is that every property is unique, and establishing one rule for everybody may create other unintended consequences in terms of the density actually being too high on a particular property than it really should be. So that's the struggle. So the path I've tried to create in this policy framework is to make sure that everything is considered, and council in the end makes an informed decision on what's appropriate. And on one property, it may be different than on another property based on the circumstances that are presented through that application process. And the more we can throw in here in terms of criteria and considerations, the better off I think the township is in making that kind of informed decision. But those are my initial thoughts. I mean, as David said, if there's a desire to put some caps in here, we can certainly take a look at it. I'd want to test them to see what that means. But certainly that's an approach that could be looked at.
Okay, thank you. Because if I look at a property like the Camp Frenda property, and I think about and if I were to own it and I saw what was happening in Minette, I might say, hey, I want that. And I'm wondering whether we're okay with that as a community, or whether we want to put some limitations on that. And I think that the time to discuss that is now, and get that into this plan if indeed we want to put some limitations on what can happen elsewhere on our lakes. And I wanted to make another comment, just picking up on what Mayor Harding said in section, what section is it again on the downzoning? Sorry, I'm just scrolling through my document. F8. F8, right, the conversion of existing resorts. I agree with his analysis that there will be some of these smaller resorts properties that will probably no longer be viable and will be looking for a way out. And if they themselves, would rather not sell to someone who is going to put up what are effectively condos in the form that they're being built today, then I think that they should have the ability to do that, to sell them to someone who wants to carve it up into a few different residential lots. Because right now the bar for that is quite high. I think there's a requirement. Sorry, I'm just trying to find it. Oh, right. It's F8C1, or I guess 2, that other uses that may be permitted as of right are either not viable as a commercial enterprise or not feasible. And you could easily say that a condo resort, a condominiumized resort, is both viable, technically feasible, commercially viable. So then say to the owner, no, you can't dam zone because there's other potential uses that are commercially viable. And I just think that's a pretty high bar and should be looked at.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Edwards.
Thank you, and to the chair. Just a couple of comments on the resort policy that you have. It's separate from Minette, and I think that might be a good thing, simply because the OMB put restrictions on us that we can't get around, but we can learn from what we've maybe done wrong, and we can tighten some of that up. And as far as unit sizes, I think there should be something. David did mention in that gross floor area, which is fine. But if I have a small resort with basically 30 bedrooms in it, and then I can build cottages with 33 bedroom cottages and call it a unit, I think we should come up with something like that. I was figuring if you go to a normal a hotel room, you can get anywhere from 200 square feet to maybe 250, which would be fine, and take it that way for low floors area. Because if you have say 2 people in a bedroom, so there's, with 30 units, that's 60. And now you put the same amount with 3-bedroom units in and that. And, you know, we're really handcuffing our small resorts that have cabins for rent, because they have to come up with all our laws and bylaws and everything. If you're renting Airbnb and that, you can get 20 people in a 3-bedroom unit, and there's no restrictions. So, you know, unless we look at that, and from what we've been told at the district, there's more Airbnb rooms for rent in Muskoka than actual resorts. So it is hurting our resorts. I don't know how you do it, but I'm just bringing that to the forefront. So there's options that we have to look at. We'll see what the public want to do with that. But, you know, I think it's something that we should be looking at and let the public decide, because I'm getting letters all the time, you know, oh, don't license B&Bs. And yet I look in the paper that Lake of Bays has just brought a bylaw in. Huntsville already has one passed, and that. So, you know, we have to look at it. But I really think that if there is a resort property and say they have so much use, maybe let them go up 10% or 15%, but not the way and that Cleveland went in the past. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Clark.
Yeah, just again, I'm trying not to get into this because you've all spent so much time on it, but I just hear some comments and it just, you know, I prayed on and talked to the people that own resorts, right? Because and got their input about their challenges and you know what their out is or what their operational plan is or what their future looks like. To say that the Marriott turned a profit in 2020, you know, I'm not being cynical, but it got built for $750 million. It went bankrupt. It got bought for $30 million. And if that's a business plan to how to create a viable resort in Muskoka, I'd say let's let the township or the district build hotels for us. And then when they go under, we'll buy them and run them. But you know, it's just, we've got to make sure we're dealing with realities. And in this particular case, we've also got a scenario where the unit holders there paid $500,000 to $800,000. They have apparently some agreement that is supposed to give them a return on their investment for the time that they rent them out. They've never been paid. They've never made a cent, to the best of my knowledge, in that agreement. And again, you know what? Cottages and all of these things aren't supposed to be investments, but we probably do need, if we want the traveling public, et cetera, and if we want tourism, we probably need viable resorts. And I don't think we're actually getting what I'm hearing, and I know I'm getting just a brief summary, is that I'm not sure we've explored it, of what a viable resort looks like and whether this will address giving somebody the opportunity to have a viable resort. And my last comment is, and you're going to think I'm a broken record, there's, I think, 60 or 70 resorts. I'm sure I'm wrong, but there's something like that, right? And at the end of the day, a bunch of them have already converted, like the Marriott, like Touchstone, like Villas. I mean, so we only probably have 25 or 30 or some number that's a fraction of the total available, where there's owners sitting there that have to have some sort of plan to continue or to get out or to downzone or to do something. And, you know, why aren't we meeting with them and saying, what's your world going to look like if we put this in place? I mean, are you done? Do you need a 2 to 3 year period to convert to your future? But if this goes in, they, you know, most of them can't afford to do what's going to happen in Manette and go get studies and put in commercial septic systems and do RCC studies and do all of these things. I mean, it's, you know, there's a bunch of people here in small resorts that are going to have zero out, and they're going to end up with something that's probably not worth a heck of a lot. So I don't know what the answer is to that. I'm just saying, please tell me you've talked to the people that are going to be impacted, because I don't see how we're going to have resorts. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Lundell.
Thanks, Chair Bridgman. I'm going back to Councillor Zavitz's comment, and I have a question for Mr. Pink. I think we have a lot more properties with this WC1 zoning and also the C1A or C1C zoning than we have operational resorts. And a number of these places are now being used as private family compounds, or there was even a listing just this past winter for a property which might get caught up in a causation study, but it was for a vacant WC1 proposing to build a luxury cottage. So I'm just wondering if we've given any thought to that kind of, I mean, effectually, it's down zoning, it's zoned as commercial resort, it's not being used that way. But if a condominium opportunity were to present itself with higher density, it might then be developed that way. And as I say, these are not functioning resorts at this time. So I'm going back to Councillor Zavitz's comment. Do we do something like present a list of these are functioning resorts? And in that case, that would protect that use as an existing use. But if there is no resort operation on the site at this time, and has not been for 10, 15, 20 years, do we go further on that kind of property?
Hey, Mr. Pink.
Thank you, Chair. Through you. You know, I think no question we're aware that there's a number of waterfront commercially zoned properties that are not functioning as currently as operating resorts. And at the end of the day, the municipality can't force a business to operate. You know, so I think sort of off the record, we're well aware that there's some properties, you know, that are zoned that way and are not operating that way. But again, there's only so much we can do. I think, as Mr. McDonald explained, I think a very important or big change that's being proposed in this current draft that the committee needs to be cognizant of is currently the reason those properties are probably in those situations is because we make it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to downzone and provide alternatives for those resort operators to use their properties for another purpose. What we're proposing in this draft, instead of identifying them as employment lands and requiring a comprehensive review in order to downzone, we're opening the door up a crack, I would say, to if they can demonstrate through fairly high bars that the properties simply are no longer viable, that perhaps they can be rezoned to a different use. And I think we've talked about it before, and I think I generally agree with the comments heard. It's once those commercially zoned properties are rezoned, I don't think we're ever going to get them back. And I've always been very hesitant to downzone because of that reason. We never know what the future will bring. 20 years from now, we may truly regret losing commercially zoned properties, because it's we see the type of public meetings we have when an existing resort looks to redevelop. I can't even fathom what it would look like if residentially zoned properties came forward and proposed a resort in our township. So once those properties are rezoned, they won't be coming back. But on the other hand, I recognize that there are certainly properties out there that just are not viable and will never be resort. They're have some extreme constraints, and I think it's appropriate to give them an opportunity to demonstrate that in order to have a viable alternative rather than operate as a family compound illegally. So I hope that provides the answer you're looking for.
Okay, Ms. Lundell, you're good. Mr. Scalati.
Yeah, I've got two comments I wanted to make. One was that I heard hints that maybe we should have a separate section in here for resorts that are really condos. And I would fully support looking at that in that direction. So separate the two, because they are two totally different things. Although I share Bob Clark's concern that maybe there isn't a great future here for what we used to know as resorts. The other thing I wanted to comment on was the thing that Liz just brought up and David Pink spoke to, and a couple others on the panel know that I had a personal interest in the idea regarding the downsizing of resorts, so specifically F8. So I just wanted to share a personal anecdote. My wife and I bought a property like that. It was a defunct resort back in the 80s. Always wanted to use it as a cottage, never thought that it was an issue. And at the time, frankly, it wasn't an issue. It just, nobody wanted to use it as a resort. Sure, go ahead and use it as a cottage. A few years went by, we decided to build on the property and put in a regular cottage. And we ran into the issue then that because we only had 175 frontage feet, we didn't have enough room to build a cottage because we were under the resort commercial restrictions, which required 250 feet was at the time, I remember. So we had to get a sanction to do it, and then never thinking that we would ever sell that cottage, gave it no more thought. And then a number of more years go by, and my wife's family property on the opposite side of the river came up as things change in a family, and parents wanted to sell it, and nobody wanted it in the family. So we decided we would take it over to keep it in the family and sell the property that we had developed on the opposite side of the river. So when the time came, we talked to a number of different realtors and pointed out to them that this was a resort commercial property. And a lot of them said, well, that's good. We can sell it either as resort commercial or as residential. It shouldn't be a problem. And it turned out that it did become a problem later on, because when the eventual buyer went to get a mortgage, of course, he was directed to the commercial lending officer in the bank, not to the residential. And it caused problems with the number of people who were interested in buying it. And finally, we were able to sell it to someone who wanted it badly enough and had the money enough. He ended up having to put down an additional more than $150,000 extra in down payment because he had to qualify for a commercial loan. That property would never be able to function as a resort. It would barely be able to function as a B&B, I suppose it could, but the neighbors wouldn't like it, I can say. But I think we do have to have provisions for the conversion of an existing resort, and I've looked at F8 carefully, and it does allow that. But I would lower the bar a little bit so that there's more discretion, so that in situations like mine, and I think there's probably another 5 generally like it on the Moon River alone that are now being used as residences as opposed to commercial property. So I guess my message is, let's allow the conversion, and when it does come up to council to review, please have sympathy for the people who are in that situation, who have lots that aren't viable anymore as commercial properties and never should be viable as commercial properties. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mayor Harding.
Thank you very much. I'll echo Mr. Scalati's comments about commercial viability and affordability when people try to do that. I've in the last 60 days did a deal on a property, and there's a residential component, but that has to be a commercial mortgage, which means that significantly more money had to be put down to qualify, which is problematic for some. I want to float an idea, and it may be aggressive, but it may solve some of the problems. We have a number of properties that are commercial potentially in nature, but operating as private residences. We know we haven't really allowed any new resorts recently. If I go back to our zoning bylaw, I think it's in the OP right now, and this caused a problem before. We don't allow any new tent and trailer parks allowed on the 3 big lakes. We stopped that. The issue with that is we didn't allow this property to be downzoned. I think the legal term is ultra vires, is which we created a property that they can't operate as a tent and trailer park because they don't exist anymore. But we wouldn't let them, and we wouldn't let them change the zone. So ended up that created problems. But what would happen if we actually made a statement in this OP that we do not allow any new commercial resorts? Took a bold stance. If you're there, you can redevelop. If you have a property that is a commercial property, we would allow you and give them the mechanism to get out of it. to downzone to waterfront residential, because it's waterfront residential properties that we're traditionally calling into current process. And I just float that as a potential idea. And again, I don't know how many properties we'd be capturing. I don't know. I think some of those people who are operating them as cottages might like that ability right now. And, you know, I think, David, to your own property, if we gave you that out, it would have made life a lot easier because it was no longer a commercial property. It was a residential waterfront and you could have built. So I just float that as an idea, Nick, to maybe consider their implications or not, but I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Zavitz.
Thank you. Just to follow up on the mayor dropping the $10 bill on the floor to see who will pick it up, I might say that, you know, talk about bold, but we don't seem to mind talking about grandfathering, bringing that back up as an issue as we contemplate this OP going forward. And that is a very prickly issue. I get it. As is what the mayor just raised. I mean, the whole commercial aspect, I could cite many properties that I know of right now that have a commercial moniker that, you know, that was a long time ago. And quite honestly, is that still befitting where we're going in the future as we craft this new document? I won't go into specifics, but there are properties right now that are being touted as commercial. They are commercial. They have the benefit of that zoning, if you will. But come on, really? I think to the mayor's point, you know, if you want to make a bold move, and Bob, you know, I'm probably going to prompt a call, you know, point from you, because certainly you bring a different slant to this, a different angle. But I'm not so sure we should limit it, but I think we need to look at it at this time. We can contemplate, do we take people's rights away by looking at a commercial property and saying effective, you know, 2024, something happens. I don't know about the implications of that, but I think it's really wise for us to look at it because there are rights presumed and assumed that may not be going down the road that we see going forward. Thank you.
Okay, Member Thompson.
I'd like to support Mayor Harding's suggestion that he made, those two suggestions that he made. And I would, I don't think it would be taking away anybody's property rights, because it would just be that you can't convert to a new resort. If you have a property that doesn't allow it. I think that's what you were suggesting, Mayor Harding, I don't know. Because I do see potential for some of these other properties to come and say, listen, I want to do this too. If it becomes quite profitable for people to to build and sell these condo units that are called, you know, they're called resort, but they're not exactly operating that way. So I think that, you know, I agree with Mayor Harding's comment, and Seguin actually has that policy, no new resorts.
Ms. Arney.
Thank you, Chair Bridgeman. Just a comment, follow up on something else the mayor touched on, and that is new camping, new trailers. The industry has expanded exponentially over the last year, and I think it is an opportunity for people who have large properties who want to turn them into something commercial, because campsites are sold out for the summer pretty much everywhere this year. And I wonder where or how we're going to address that in this OP going forward.
Okay. I don't see any more comments at the moment, Mr. McDonald. So I guess you've taken in what you've heard and carry on.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those were all great comments and certainly lots to think about. I particularly was interested in the tent and trailer park comment because there is currently a prohibition in your existing official plan on new tent and trailer parks on the waterfront. And that's not in the draft. And that was done a little bit deliberately, only because it is another form of accommodation. But it may be an option for those who have resort properties who are looking for something different. So putting that out there. One quick comment on the mayor's suggestion about prohibiting resorts. I'd be very cautious about doing that. I'm thinking that would probably send the wrong message in a lot of different ways. I'm much more of a proponent of establishing paths forward for you to make informed decisions, which in the end could be no or yes to an application. And that's how this policy framework has been set up, both for new and redeveloping resorts and also for the downzoning of existing resorts. And the more thought we put into what that path looks like and the criteria that you would consider, I think the better off you are as a township in defending decisions when you have to make them. If you just say no to resorts and have nothing to say about it, I don't think it's as defensible as actually having a path and then saying no in the end. Anyways, I'll leave that there. That's a very philosophical conversation. In any event, this has been very helpful for me. I'm not sure what comes out of it specifically in terms of changes I'm making to this before it goes out to the public, because there wasn't a specific policy direction on this other than to incorporate something on occupancy that was along the lines of what was agreed to or at least suggested in Minette. So there is no policy direction that provides the basis for a lot of what we just talked about today. So something to consider, and perhaps we can have a conversation about this at our next meeting in terms of where we go with these policies. And I guess I'm suggesting two options. One, they go out as is. We've talked about them, and we get a fulsome set of comments after the second draft goes out, and we have a further discussion about where refinements are needed, or if there's direction to be provided on making changes now, we can have that conversation. Quite frankly, I don't know which way we're going at this point because of all the comments that have been made. So I'm going to leave that there, unless Chair Bridgeman, you have a suggestion.
No, but I just see that Member Arnie would like to speak. I would assume to what you're saying. So,
yes, thank you, Chair Bridgeman, and through you to Nick. I believe we established that there is not clarity on the fact that what is in here now relates to resort condominium applications as opposed to resorts across the board. So maybe at least that clarification could be had.
Very good point, and I did agree that certainly that was in my mind and in all of our minds when we put this together, but it doesn't directly deal with the Sherwoods and the Shamrocks of the world because they're not condominiums, and if they wanted to expand, that would be a different process for them, unless they wanted to convert their whole property into a condominium, then these policies would apply. Very good comment. So that is something we'll certainly consider. And when we come back with the second draft, we'll have some further thoughts on that.
okay, so I think Ms. Thompson would also like to chime in.
Yeah, I guess the one of the issues I have with sending this policy set out to the public for comment is that it, well, I've already said that it's not necessarily reflective of some of the Minette Steering Committee work. But I guess more particularly, it's the objectives are the same as the district objectives from 2017 with the addition of a couple of clauses that are respective of the environment, which I really appreciate, which is great. And we haven't discussed as a group yet what we think are the objectives for resorts. And the way a resort is defined through this policy set is as a roofed accommodation that has recreational facilities, which is very broad, and my cottage could fit under that category. And so it says it has to be commercial. And really the only test for commerciality is whether it's in a rental pool, whether it's available to the traveling and vacationing public. That's really the only test that we have for commerciality. And so unless I'm reading this incorrectly. So given that that's a test and it's going to be very difficult to monitor and enforce that, and other municipalities have given up on it, I fear that we're just allowing these commercial properties to become something other than commercial through this policy set at a density that is a commercial density. And I don't know what the answer is to that. But it scares me. And to me, that's not a cautious approach to development on our lakes. And so that's one of the reasons why I liked Mayor Harding's suggestion of no new resorts.
Thank you. Councillor Jaglowitz.
Thank you. Yes, I just heard something that disturbed me, and I just want to make sure I heard it correctly. Am I led to believe that this policy direction insists that any new resort development be by way of condominium? Because I certainly wouldn't support that. In other words, I think we should be encouraging resorts to be fully owned by the operator and not the condominium approach. So I certainly, the risk we run when we allow the condominium, well, first of all, that's a method of financing a resort. So we can't say it's not allowed, but it leads into that resort use or that residential use again. So I think we should be encouraging wholly owned resort operations, and we have to be realistic in allowing some form of condominium ownership, as long as the resort again operates as a resort. So I just want to make sure that I didn't misunderstand that. Thank you.
Yeah, and in response to that, and I agree that it could be clearer in this policy set, but that would certainly be my preference as a planner, that it be a wholly owned operation, functioning as a hotel, renting out rooms. It's, we're not into this rental pool discussion and enforceability discussions and all kinds of other conversations. So certainly the policies can be made much more strongly. I think what we were trying to do was to react to the reality of the recent applications we've been getting, where plans of condominium are desired, and here is how we would deal with that kind of a circumstance. So I agree that there could be more clarity on that. And it's, some of these policies are really set up, if someone wants to go down this road, here is all of the things we would consider and apply, but we hope you don't have to go down that road or want to, because we really want to see wholly owned resorts as a first principle. So I think we can state that much more clearly in this policy set. I would agree.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Roberts.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you. We just spent 2.5 hours talking about resort, which was really great. But I don't think that we're ready just to push forward with a few small tweaks, this section. And I think it needs more work, just from what I'm getting around and different suggestions. So that's my opinion. You need to have this come back to us before we allow it to go forward. Thank you.
Mr. McDonald, would it be helpful if we did a straw vote sort of on Mayor Harding's suggestion, no more new resorts?
Well, I mean, you can decide on whatever approach you want to take. Might I make a suggestion that perhaps that be held off into the next meeting, just so that we can all you can all sit with what you've just heard and go down that road. As I mentioned, I'm a little concerned about there being a prohibition being included within the official plan. I'm not sure that's, I'm going to say it out loud, as defensible as having a path as we put together for you to consider. So I want you to really be cautious about making that kind of decision. So I'll just leave that there, and perhaps that could be put on the table for the next meeting. Okay.
Councillor Zavitz.
Thank you. And to coach that, I think what the mayor's direction is in another way, instead of saying, here's what we don't allow, what we do allow would be commercially viable resorts. And I think to Bob Clark's earlier comment about, for example, not to name names, but the Muskoka, to pick one as an example and see the viability of that particular model versus others. I don't think we want to say no resorts. I think that's a large bite all of a sudden. But I do think that there has to be a test for commercial viability. And we've just spent an hour and 2.5 hours talking about just that very point. And my first note when Nick started talking at 9:04 was, let's define resorts. And here we are 2.5 hours later, trying to define commercial viability and limiting this and that and the other thing. what's viable to one person commercially is certainly different than another. I'm not sure we should be, in the bedrooms of our people. Thank you.
Okay, Mayor Harding.
Thank you. Two comments. One, I struggle with trying to ensure commercial viability, getting into somebody's business and their books and everything. When we talk about commercial viability, the neighbor's cottage that rents on Airbnb may be more commercially viable than some of the resorts that are being built. So what are we really evaluating here? What we're trying to say is it's a resort, it has available traveling public, so on and so forth. There are people who buy investment properties for loss reasons. Let's be honest about it here, and for other personal benefit. So I struggle with what we're evaluating in that whole concept. Let me come back and just, Nick, I want to, if I may, characterize what I'm talking about no new, and it's new resorts. We have commercial properties that may be allowed to be developed into a resort, and especially those on the waterfront. If they're not operating as a resort, if they're not there today, to me, that may be the ability to say, no, we don't want to see a new resort because, and again, they can always come in for an official plan amendment. Let's be honest here, even though we say no, and we've gone down that road. But what I think the idea being, if we've seen a change in sector from traditional resort accommodation, we might be able to solve a few of the concerns and fears of people creating resorts that aren't really resorts. If I've got a resort, it's operating as a resort, I can redevelop it as a resort, that's fine. But for those few odd properties that are not currently, but they're zoned potentially that they could be a resort, that's all I'm trying to say, and trying to capture that minority. So I leave that with you just from a language perspective going forward. But I don't think if we provided a path forward and a down zoning for those specific properties, I think it's actually a net positive than a potential negative to the general population.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Kelly.
Thank you. And through you, just a few thoughts. I'm going to agree with Nick on one thing, and there's on a lot of things, but on the most recent thing is this idea of some kind of outright prohibition. I think that's just an invitation to litigation. I think when you start telling people no, I think you're just going to wind up in court, especially if it's people who perhaps bought, sold, or valued their property based on one set of understandings that you're now denying them. So I prefer the path of a multi-level decision tree kind of to qualify to build something that may often result in a no decision, but it's a little bit of a different approach. The other thing to follow on was a member Zavitz, and I think it's maybe a bit of a repeat of member Thompson. I agree that commercial viability is at the center of all of this. These things are built with certain densities and other forgivenesses because they are commercial resorts. And if the aggregated resort cannot turn a profit or has no prospect of turning a profit from its resort activities alone, if it requires kind of residential subsidy for the residential activity, it's not a commercial resort. And likewise, if the individual unit that's bought and held by somebody as an investor or a part-time resident, if it can't service its debt load and pay the condo fees and so forth, it's not a commercially viable resort either, which leaves me wondering what part of this is commercially viable. And I think that I realize to Mayor Harding's suggestion, I mean, that's a very complicated route to go, but we got to figure out how to get there if we're going to rely on commercial viability to establish the existence of a resort to give density and other concessions in its construction. And that's all I have to say.
Okay, thank you. I believe we are now at the last of the comments for that, Mr. McDonald.
I believe so. I think we should move on, and I think for the next 20 minutes, I'd like to try to get through a few of the remaining policy directions, and then we can stop perhaps at 10 to 12, and then discuss next steps, and perhaps when a further meeting should be held. So I'm really quickly going to switch gears and turn to policy direction number 20. And that deals with regulating expansion of existing marinas and other waterfront commercial uses. And I'm going to ask Mr. Dyment, who's been waiting patiently, to provide his insights on this particular section that he was primarily responsible for. Thanks, Jim.
Sure. This should be fairly quick. The revisions to the official plan dealing with marinas are in E9 of the official plan. And we essentially kept the existing policies in the official plan, save and except for the following. In terms of the policies for new marina development, we added a provision saying sufficient parking and loading areas to provide for water access properties. Remember our discussion about waterfront landings, including provisions for commercial uses and guest parking. There's nothing in the official plan right now that requires provisions for guest parking for water access properties. And so we think that that's necessary. Also, the next one, we added requirement for adequate provision of garbage recycling and washroom facilities, particularly for these marinas that have large waterfront landings. People need these facilities at them, and there's no requirement for them at the present time. The rest of the policies are pretty much, I think, almost exactly the existing policies that you have right now, and they work well. Not to further the discussion that you just had, but I think it's pretty unlikely that someone's going to buy a property in Township Muskoka Lakes on the water to operate a marina. So the new policies really are going to look at what happens when you get new applications for site plan approval. And that's why we mentioned, oh, one thing I forgot was the other one, the adequate stormwater management to provide for treatment of quality and quantity has been added in the provisions, again, to make sure that where we have these large impermeable surfaces that we're thinking about what happens with the water that runs off of them and ends up in the lake. And so those are the changes that we added. I think they follow the planning directions completely. And I'll just add, Nick, it might save a little bit of time. The next section, waterfront contractors, exactly the same as the existing official plan. It works well. We know these things are necessary. So we didn't change the policies at all.
Okay, thank you. I see that excuse me, Member Clark would like to comment.
May not be the right section, so if it isn't, we can ignore. But I agree. I don't think anybody's buying anything to become a marina at this point. But if we go forward with everything the way we've stated it, we could have a lot of people buying landings, and I'm not sure what the difference is between a marina and a landing. We could have multiple boats at a landing, multiple people buying a piece of land, trying to stick a dock on there and throw 10 boats on it. And right now, you know, we had a meeting on Monday that had some different input, but if we just keep saying, hey, we're going to go ahead and just give this to the public and let them deal with it, I think we have a concern if we still have the deeded access for islands on there. We're going to have 100-foot lots being sold as landings, and I don't know what we have in there to deal with it. So just my input on that.
Okay, so I think that's another area. Bob, in terms of the deeded access, and we're coming back to that. We are coming back to that, Bob. So hold that thought and bring it up again.
Great. Oh, sorry.
Councillor Zavitz.
Thank you. And again, commercial viability. I mean, I've got to be honest, I am very concerned as a resident, as a user for all of our years here, to Bob, to the mayor's point earlier, you know, there aren't any, I don't see anybody opening up a new marina. I do not see the commercial viability of that. And I think we need to respect and protect the marinas that are existing, that are here, that are in some cases 100 years old. When they go, there is no one starting up a new marina. Interesting point. When you're on the Moon River, you know, you can't drive your boat to a place to get gas. You simply bring in your gas from a gas station for your boat. When you're on the three big lakes, which is one of our basic precepts, is day boating, etc. You know, when we lose a marina, when they're not commercially viable, when we tie their hands and make them, you know, do this, do that, and the other thing, we make it difficult for them, more difficult for them to make a buck. I did hear what you said, Jim. We're going to leave everything status quo, but my only thought would be, I think, to respect and recognize them as business. That is a commercially viable situation that we need to maintain and assist in. Thank you.
Okay, Member Arnie.
Thank you, Chair Bridgeman. And like Member Clark, I'm not sure if this is the place to address it, but it does concern what is a marina. I wonder at what point, how many dry storage, blue wrapped boats does it take for a property to be designated a dry land marina? Certainly, we're, you know, along the 169 and in several areas, we're getting large properties covered with blue tarp all winter. And I don't know how you regulate it or if there is a way to do it, but I think it is something. Obviously, there's a need for them, but like Airbnbs, I wonder if it's time to regulate them.
So, Director Pink, can you let us know what the zoning, et cetera, and regulations are in the?
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I would argue they are regulated. They're regulated through the zoning bylaw. Really, the differentiation, if someone has a large number of private boats and they choose to store them on their property, there's likely nothing we can do about it. But if someone is running a business and they're collecting boats from numerous people and making a profit to store boats on their property should be zoned to permit that use. So I think it's a question of probably increased enforcement or monitoring of that. But you may not be aware, there was a recent proposal on Mortimer's Point Road to allow that use. There are some pockets of property zone that do allow marinas under the zoning bylaw. So I don't mean to be alarmist, they could very well be permitted, what you're seeing. The other thing we can look at through future changes in our zoning bylaw, is increased setbacks or buffering of those. So where the use is occurring, at least those passerby don't have to see fields of blue tarps all winter. So we can do perhaps a better job of requiring that through the site plan process, increased setbacks and buffering, berming, fencing, things of that nature.
Thank you, Mr. Pink. Councillor Nishikawa.
Thank you. Through you to David, it's interesting, just the comment about the blue tarps and things. And I remember when, in fact, it was Martin Ford that came forward to put a facility at 169 and Moon River Road. And we put some restrictions in place for him that, in fact, he was not to be using the blue tarps. It was suggested, I would say, but I believe that he took it strongly. I can't remember if it was mandated or not, but in fact to use white. But we also have been successful over the years of going after those property owners that, for instance, I remember, and Donelda might remember, there was a property on Walker's Point Road that, again, it was just a private residential property that chose to have a lot of boat storage. And then we have the other bylaw that says you can only store so many things on your property. Like, for instance, so many boats and so many automobiles that are not fenced in and that type of thing. It feels like we're missing some of that here, the things that we've already passed in the past. Just some of the conversation that made me sound like the work that we've done over the years actually was just in passing rather than taking a foothold, I guess. And you're right, like I'm very concerned. Like we have a boat storage on a residential property, a very, very small residential property in downtown Torrance, you know, that is very, I think it's very difficult to be the neighboring property owners. But again, I'm not sure that we actually covered what we've actually put in place in the past in this particular bylaw or in the OP right now.
Director Pink.
Just very quickly, thank you, Chair. I don't believe we have the authority or ability through planning documents to control the color of boat wrap. So I'm not sure. I know Mr. Ford's development, I think, predates me. It was, I think, late 90s at the Township that it was approved, or early 2000s. But I think we're getting a little off topic. I don't think these matters are typical official plan type issues. I think what we're referring to are site plan matters, zoning matters, and also bylaw enforcement matters. And as council well knows, there's been new staff retained. We'll be bringing a policy forward, hopefully in the relatively near future, that talks about more proactive patrolling and enforcement. And if there are properties being used out there for marina uses that are zoned residential, we'll certainly take the steps to properly address those. But I think we can move on. I don't think, I think the OP, the policy direction, is in regard to redeveloping existing marinas. These issues, like I say, are more enforcement related.
Thank you. I don't see any more comments at this stage, Mr. McDonald.
All right, so we still have a few policy directions left. Some of them are quite straightforward, but there are still a couple, most notably mineral aggregate resources, that I know that there's going to be some discussion on. So I'm going to suggest at this point that we stop with the policy directions and we think about what the next steps should be in this process. Clearly, there's a need for another meeting, so I think the focus right now should be on figuring out when that could be. So I'm in your hands, Chair Bridgeman, on how you want to approach that.
Oh, well, I think we should set it up right now. And I think, again, we're going to start with you, Mr. Dyment, in terms of availability.
So I'll start with myself, morning of the 21st or the 26th works. Let's try those two and see how far we get.
No,
26th for me.
No, on the 21st. What about the 26th?
The 26th works for me.
Is it? Okay, so Councillor Jaglowitz, I see your hand up. Would you like to something? We'll just pause for a second and let him.
No, that's fine. The 21st doesn't work for me. That's a district meeting, but you've already rolled it out. 26 works.
So did we once again hit everybody? Fun is really good. So, okay, the 26th at, we're going to start at 9 again?
Yeah, 9 to 12.
9 to 12. Okay.
So in terms of what I see happening at the next meeting, just to reiterate, is we'll finish off the policy directions as the first order of business. I'm hopeful that would only take up perhaps up to a half hour. Then I suggest that we talk about that chart that I prepared. Mr. Dyment's laughing, but we'll try for half an hour. And then the second thing we'll do is we'll work on the. I have everybody's faces on my screen. Maybe that's not a good thing. The other thing we'll do then is look at that chart that we collectively prepared that I think really assists in advancing the conversation. And I just wanted to leave this with you, is that what we've done in the official plan, in my view, reflects exactly what the policy directions wanted us to do as a consulting team. So we've delivered what you've asked for. And through these conversations, some folks have said, well, they didn't really understand the cumulative impact of all of these individual directions in terms of development, approval processes, and so on. And that's fair. I mean, how could you when you made all these decisions? So what I'm going to suggest is that when we go through that chart next week or at our next meeting, if there's a feeling that the direction initially given should be changed, that would be the time for that to happen. So for example, I'm just going to pick on lot frontages. you thought it was all a great idea at the time, but now that you see it with all of the other ones, you don't think so. Fair enough. You have to change the policy direction that was initially given to us for that to actually happen. I'd rather not do that on the fly and then have those policy directions sit out there and somebody says, well, how did you get from here to here without something happening in between? So something to think about. And then after that, I think we would leave some time for any other matters that haven't yet been discussed. And among those other matters would be exactly what you're expecting from us as a team in terms of a next draft. And then we would tell you how long we would take, and then we'd figure out what that means in terms of timing and so on. So that's how I see the next meeting going, Chair Bridgeman.
Oh, excellent. Just 1 minute. Our clerk, do you want to say something? Okay, our clerk would like to say something.
Hi, I guess it's not quite noon, but so good morning. I was just wondering if we can commit to longer than noon on that day so we can finish it, because we do have other items other than planning to deal with.
I'm certainly prepared personally to go to 1 o'clock if that's helpful, but I think 4 hours would be an absolute max for something like this personally.
Okay, so we are running into constraints in terms here of numbers of meetings and staff and what they have to perform, and it's becoming very obvious for us, Mr. McDonald. So I think that's so. I'm going to suggest maybe if we could do a half-hour break at 12 o'clock. Can we get back in for another 2.5 hours? Are we available for that?
That's fine. We can certainly make that work.
But thank you. It's really helpful in terms of our clerk's office, who are being run off their feet right now. And no, I know it's everybody, but we haven't highlighted the clerk's office that much yet. We are now. Okay. So that would be on the 26th. And maybe we can say noon till 3, and we'll have a half an hour break for lunch. And hopefully we will get it all. Let's just say I'm going to take the professional planner's optimism course in hand here and say, well, get it done then.
Great.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for all of the comments and the input today, and to our consultants for their work. And everybody have a really good weekend, and we'll see you back here on the 26th. Okay, thank you. Oh, adjourn. Oh, adjourn. Don't run away. Someday I'll get this all right. And maybe. Yeah, stop laughing, Cheryl. Yeah, okay. Okay, what's this one first? Oh, no, we don't need that yet. Okay. Moved by Councillor Roberts, seconded by Councillor Zavitz. Be it resolved that the Special Planning Committee meeting adjourn at 11:57 a.m. All in favor? Okay, great. Now I will.
Is Councillor Roberts on the call? Is Councillor Roberts here?
He's gone.
Oh, he went. Oh, thank you very much. So Councillor Hayes will be moving this.
Okay.
Please. And seconded by Councillor Zavitz. All in favor? Okay. Thank you, everyone. Great morning and have a really good weekend.
Thank you.
Okay.